Hello, everyone. So we are going to go over chapter 18, which is interventions in spirituality and counseling. Um, so I want to kind of just start off by stating that understanding that spirituality and counseling does not always mean that you are focusing on a client who is having issues with their spirituality. Okay, so well, yes, integrating spirituality and counseling can mean that the client is having issues in their spirituality and trying to approach that and understand that that is something that could happen. But also understand that, like, the purpose of integrating spirituality and counseling is also to use it as a tool to understand the client a little bit more. It can be a tool to help treat the client, and it can also be a tool as an intervention. Okay. So if you have a client who is struggling with severe anxiety, um, they may not necessarily have a spirituality issue, so to speak, right? But if they are spiritual or however that may be, you could use that as a part of your interventions and strategies when working with the client. So at the very beginning of the chapter, it had quoted Koenig and says that, he provided 10 ways in which spirituality can help to reduce stress, improve coping, and strengthen recovery. So again, this client coming to you with severe anxiety is not indicating any issues in their spirituality and their spiritual beliefs and things like that, but that their spirituality can help to reduce stress, improve coping, and strengthen recovery. So, think about some of the discussion boards that you have done up to this point with those different case studies. You're not looking at it in a sense of, am I diagnosing this person with an issue of spirituality, right? You're looking at it as, how can I understand their perspective of spirituality and integrate that into the treatment that we are going to be utilizing throughout their time. Okay. So recognize the role of spirituality in diagnosing. Um, so understanding that you should, if you are going to use spirituality in your approach, you should integrate spiritual assessments in the diagnosing process. When you recognize the role of spirituality in diagnosing, it can enhance the client's well-being. So you can identify and emphasize spiritual strengths and resources that contribute to the client's resilience and coping mechanisms. So I know one of the things that Dr. Smith had gone over is the use of spiritual genograms, but you can also use like spiritual history tools to map out spiritual resources and practices that support the client's well-being. We'll go back to, so let's say we have a client who's struggling with severe anxiety. You can start to figure out what are some spiritual resources and practices that they already have and they're aware of that can help support their well-being. Okay. Recognizing the role of spirituality in diagnosing can also contribute to client problems, right? So recognize when spiritual or religious beliefs might be contributing to the client's difficulties. So in this aspect, you will want to use open-ended questions to explore potential conflicts or guilt associated with religious beliefs. So maybe you have a client who um, is very traditionally Catholic or very traditionally Muslim, but they are, recently questioning their spiritual beliefs because it's not lining up with how they're currently living their life, right? And so they may be experiencing some guilt about some of the things that they are doing, or maybe that they're interacting with. And that's going to be something that you can explore a little bit more for them to identify and understand their spirituality and how it relates to their current practices. And then also understanding that it can exacerbate symptoms. So you want to work to identify how spiritual or religious beliefs might intensify clients' symptoms. So monitor how religious practices or beliefs may be linked to increased stress or avoidance behaviors. So one of the things that you could look into is, if you have a client with OCD, they might have compulsions that are tied to religious rituals which would exacerbate their symptoms, right? So again, one of the tools that Dr. Smith talked about that you could use in this is the spiritual genogram, which is where you'll chart the client's spiritual history and practices. And then you can also use a spiritual eco map, which is where you can map out the client's spiritual resources and stressors in their environment. Another way that you can integrate spirituality into counseling, right? And these are some of the interventions that you can use, is to make sure that you're doing a collaborative goal setting. So, like we have said from the very beginning, it is important to collaborate with the client on their understanding of their own spirituality. While you and the client may have the same belief systems, the way that you will interact with that may be very different. Okay. You will also may have very different belief systems. So it's important for you to get a full understanding of that and collaborate with the client in order to understand what their understanding of spirituality is. Once you've laid that foundation, you'll want to work with them to set goals, right? So you want to involve the client in setting therapeutic goals that align with their spiritual values and beliefs. An example of this could be you may have a client who wants to set a goal to integrate daily prayer into their routine to enhance mindfulness and reduce anxiety. If you use that intervention with a client who does not practice prayer, that's not going to be beneficial, right? So you want to make sure that you're working with the client. Some different types of interventions that you can use in this approach is values clarification exercise. So I like to use this activity called the value card sort. And then you can also use SMART goals, right? Like let's get the client into setting some of their own SMART goals that align with their spiritual perspective. Up next, we have modifying techniques and utilizing spiritual practices. So, making sure that you, as the counselor, are adapting your therapeutic techniques to include spiritual perspectives. So, you want to tailor existing therapeutic techniques to respect and incorporate the client's spiritual beliefs, right? So maybe that means adjusting cognitive behavioral techniques to include spiritual affirmations, right? So what that could look like is if the client is struggling with negative self-talk and you want to replace that negative self-talk with affirmations, you may use the affirmation, I am loved and valued in the eyes of my higher power, right? So that is an integration of spirituality and counseling and an intervention that you can use, right? So interventions can still be the same interventions that you have learned throughout your time in school, but how do you incorporate that spirituality in there? I know in this chapter, it talks about the Enneagram and utilizing the Enneagram and the different types and what types of modalities you can use for that. So that's also a good thing and a good tool that you can look at. You also want to look at utilizing spiritual practices in the therapy when appropriate, right? So maybe you can integrate practices like prayer, meditation, or religious rituals into the counseling process. Maybe the client is really trying to focus more on mindfulness, that aligns more with like their Buddhist practices. And so if you have a client who is, trying to focus more on mindfulness and meditation within their Buddhist practice, maybe you will lead that in one of their sessions to help them navigate that. Now, if you have no training in this or you have no idea how to do this, that's not going to be beneficial for you or the client. But this is a whole part of us understanding that there are different approaches to spirituality and learning that and then trying to integrate that. The next one here is making sure that you are applying theory and research. So anytime you are integrating spirituality into your practice and using different types of interventions, always use an intervention that has, applicable research and evidence-based practices behind it, right? So like I said earlier, you can utilize CBT and integrate spirituality in that. It's just the way that you go about doing it. Okay. So the interventions are going to remain the same as to what you already know with a few additions. Um, and then you just want to figure out, like, what does it look like to integrate the spirituality in there? Not your spirituality, but the client's. One of the things that it does talk about in the chapter is the role of spirituality in group dynamics. So you can, in terms of group dynamics, you can utilize group members' spiritual strengths, right? So when you're in group settings, there is likely to be different spiritual um, beliefs and perspectives, unless it is a spiritually focused group. In that case, then they may be more similar. But you really want to make sure that you're conducting like group spiritual assessments to really identify and utilize the spiritual strengths and resources of each group member. So, what this may look like is group members might discuss how their faith or meditation practices can help them cope with stress. Um, but you want to be really intentional about this, right? You also want to recognize when spiritual or religious beliefs can contribute to group members' issues, right? And so you want to, you know, really talk about, especially if this is a spiritual group, that's going to be a big focus of it. But if it's not, like, you can still bring this in and maybe talk about how, a member might share how religious guilt exacerbates their anxiety, which then provides an opportunity for the group to offer support and alternative perspectives, right? And so understanding that spirituality is going to be a big part for a lot of people. And then lastly, you also want to be aware of how spirituality might exacerbate symptoms or reduce symptoms. Okay. So you want to make sure that, like we just talked about, spirituality practices can exacerbate symptoms, but it can also reduce symptoms if you're using their understanding of their spirituality and their spirituality resources that they already have in order to be skills that they practice with. Different things that you can use within the group setting are very similar to the individual setting. You just do it as a group instead. So you can do a group spiritual genogram, you can do a group spiritual eco map, you can do the values clarification activities, you can set SMART goals in the group. You can do group spiritual affirmations, you can do guided spiritual imagery. So a lot of those techniques are going to be the same. The only difference, and really I wouldn't say that it is a difference, but the only thing that I would make sure of is making sure that you're really taking the time to set a foundation of understanding the client's perspective of spirituality. All right, and then the last thing I just wanted to touch on, with the integration and use of interventions of spirituality in counseling, just make sure, there are ethical and professional considerations of this, right? So always respect and honor the client's spiritual or religious beliefs and practices and ensure that interventions are client-centered. Make sure that you are pursuing ongoing education and training in spiritual and religious competencies. So like I said, if you have a client who practices Buddhism and wants to integrate more mindfulness and meditation, and then you want to help lead that in one of your sessions, but you're not trained in it, that's not going to be beneficial, right? It's also unethical to do that. And then lastly, you want to ensure that clients are fully informed about the incorporation of spiritual interventions in their therapy and consent to their use. So just making sure that as you're using these interventions, that there is an informed consent, that they are wanting to integrate this. I always go by the practice of, I do not utilize spirituality in my practice unless the client is okay with it. Throughout my time getting to know them, I do try to understand their concept of spirituality and what that is for them and how they practice it daily. And then if the time does arise, then I may ask them, hey, I've noticed that you've talked about like your connection with nature. Is this something that we could utilize in our practice to maybe help reduce some of your symptoms or maybe understand them more? And just kind of let them take the lead on that, because what we may see as spiritual, they may not see as spiritual, right? And maybe it is something they want to explore. So just be mindful with that. However, I hope that this has helped. And if you have any questions, just let me know.